December 1944, Camp Shanks, New York. Snow drifted softly across the barbed wire that encircled the hospital ward. Inside, rows of metal beds lined the room, filled with wounded German prisoners captured in France. Their faces were pale with exhaustion and quiet fear. They expected harsh words, perhaps silence, not kindness. Then the sound came, a woman's voice, calm and fluent, asking in perfect German, "Wo tut is weh? Where does it hurt?" The soldiers froze. The nurse, adjusting the bandage on a man's arm, spoke their language without hesitation. Another followed, giving instructions in clear, practiced German. The tension in the room changed. The prisoners stared at each other, unsure whether they were dreaming or being deceived. The war had taught them to expect enemies, not empathy. But here, behind the wire, America's nurses were breaking that rule. By late 1944, America was not only winning the war abroad, it was hosting it at home. Across the United States, more than 370,000 German prisoners of war were held in over 425 camps scattered from Texas to Pennsylvania. They were captured in North Africa, Normandy, and the Italian front, then transported across the Atlantic under the strict rules of the 1929 Geneva Convention. These camps were orderly, guarded, and efficient. Prisoners worked on nearby farms, built roads, and repaired equipment. For many Americans, it was the first time they saw the enemy up close, not as faceless soldiers in propaganda reels, but as ordinary men. Farmers exchanged cautious nods with German laborers. Children stared at them through fences. But the largest concentration of prisoners, the wounded, arrived at Army hospital compounds. Camps like Camp Atterbury in Indiana, Camp Swift in Texas, and Camp Shanks in New York became centers of unexpected encounters. Rows of temporary wards filled with men who had once marched under Hitler's banners now lay under the care of U.S. Army nurses. The military's challenge wasn't hostility, it was communication. Many German soldiers didn't speak English. Medical treatment required understanding pain, symptoms, consent. So the War Department quietly began reassigning bilingual nurses, daughters of German immigrants, women who had grown up hearing two languages at their family tables. They were professionals trained in medicine, but their voices would become something far more powerful than medicine itself. It started as a logistical solution. It became one of the quietest moral victories of the entire war. By 1945, the U.S. Army Nurse Corps had expanded beyond anything the pre-war military could have imagined. From fewer than 7,000 members in 1940 to over 60,000 women serving around the globe. They operated under the Red Cross emblem, tending to wounds in field hospitals from Normandy to New Guinea. But in the continental United States, another group of nurses worked in quiet anonymity, assigned to German POW wards in Army hospitals. Many of these women had German surnames: Müller, Schmidt, Bauer, Reinhardt, daughters and granddaughters of immigrants who had settled in the Midwest decades earlier. When war came, they found themselves caring for men who might have come from the same villages as their grandparents. Their ability to speak fluent German became a practical necessity and a psychological revelation. Commanders discovered that communication transformed behavior. German prisoners who initially resisted orders began cooperating. Recovery rates in bilingual wards improved. Reports noted fewer fights, fewer suicides, and an almost complete absence of escape attempts. The language barrier had been more than medical, it had been emotional. In letters preserved by the Army Medical Department archives, nurses described their patients not as enemies, but as frightened boys far from home. One wrote, "When I told him in German that his fever had broken, he cried not from pain, but from hearing his mother's language again." The U.S. Army had accidentally uncovered a profound truth of warfare. Communication could disarm more effectively than weapons. Soon, the idea spread beyond hospitals. Other camps requested bilingual staff. Commanders realized that understanding the enemy didn't weaken discipline, it strengthened humanity. And in the wards where the war's noise finally went silent, that humanity began to speak fluently. For the German prisoners, the shock was immediate and deeply personal. They had been trained to believe that capture by Americans meant humiliation, perhaps brutality. Nazi propaganda had painted Allied camps as places of starvation and revenge. But in those sterile hospital rooms with white curtains and polished floors, the reality was nothing like what they had imagined. The first surprise came not from medicine but from language. When an American nurse adjusted a bandage and said in clear German, "Du bist in Sicherheit jetzt, you're safe now," a soldier's fear dissolved into silence. Some stared in disbelief, others whispered questions. How could their enemy sound like their mother, their teacher, their sister? The nurses treated every man by the same code: wound first, uniform second. They changed dressings, administered morphine, wrote letters home for those who couldn't. Many German soldiers tried to thank them formally, saluting from their beds until gently told, "No ranks here." These moments carried weight far beyond the walls of the camp. To the nurses, it was simple duty to heal whoever lay before them. But for the prisoners, it became a quiet unraveling of everything they'd been told about Americans. The U.S. War Department later recorded that discipline inside POW hospitals improved dramatically wherever bilingual nurses served. Patients became cooperative, volunteering to assist in wards or write translations for new arrivals. The act of being understood changed everything, from hostility to gratitude, from isolation to conversation. In a war defined by dehumanization, the sound of a familiar word was enough to restore dignity. It reminded both sides that before the flags and ideologies, there had been shared humanity and a shared language to prove it. For the American nurses, the experience was equally transformative. They entered the service prepared to treat Allied soldiers, not German captives. Many had brothers or husbands fighting overseas. Some had lost loved ones to Luftwaffe raids or submarine attacks. Yet when the stretchers arrived, carrying men who could barely whisper, the instinct to heal overcame every thought of vengeance. One nurse, writing in her diary at Camp Berry, captured the conflict. "I looked at his uniform and thought of my brother in Belgium. Then I looked at his hands, burned, trembling, human. I cleaned them without another thought." Psychologists later noted that these bilingual wards became small laboratories of reconciliation. When prisoners realized their nurses could understand every word, conversations changed. They began to speak openly about their doubts, their exhaustion, their disillusionment with the Reich, their longing for home. Some even confessed guilt, not to interrogators, but to nurses who simply listened. The impact reached German morale in ways no leaflet ever could. Letters intercepted by censors revealed prisoners describing the kindness of American nurses as a shock to the soul. One wrote home, "They care for us as if we were their own. It is not weakness, it is strength." Within months, these interactions were quietly influencing the War Department's Psychological Warfare Division. Reports noted that humane treatment, especially medical care, was undermining Nazi propaganda faster than any speech or broadcast. Kindness had become strategy. To the nurses, though, it wasn't politics. It was professionalism and conscience. They weren't healing soldiers for a cause. They were healing men because that was their oath. When asked years later why they treated enemy prisoners with such devotion, one replied, "Because if we stopped seeing them as human, the war would never end." That philosophy, born in hospital tents and POW wards, would soon meet its greatest test, when the wounded of both armies arrived by the hundreds and compassion had to fight fatigue itself. By the spring of 1945, American hospitals were receiving a flood of casualties from both sides of the collapsing front. Trains arrived daily with stretchers, some bearing U.S. soldiers, others carrying captured Germans from France, Belgium, and North Africa. In the makeshift wards at Camp Swift, Texas, and Camp Shanks, New York, the war's front lines met under one roof. The Red Cross documented the moment when language became a bridge instead of a barrier. Lieutenant Margaret Holtz, an Army nurse born to German parents in Milwaukee, served in one of the busiest POW wards. Her reports describe exhaustion beyond endurance, 16-hour shifts, no days off, yet she remembered one night with clarity. A young German lieutenant, suffering from shrapnel wounds, refused treatment, insisting that Americans would poison him. Holtz sat beside him and spoke softly in his own language. The shock on his face turned to confusion, then relief. He allowed her to clean his wounds, murmuring, "I did not know Americans could sound like home." That night changed the atmosphere of the entire ward. Word spread that some of the nurses spoke like mothers. Prisoners stopped resisting care. Some volunteered to help move supplies or translate for others. American doctors noticed faster recoveries, fewer breakdowns, and a calm that statistics couldn't explain. It wasn't strategy or orders from command. It was empathy, spoken fluently. In those wards, under the hum of generators and the smell of antiseptic, the war seemed to pause. For a few fleeting hours each day, the front lines dissolved. The Geneva Convention demanded humane treatment, but what these nurses gave went far beyond the law. It was understanding. And in the final months of the war, that understanding would change lives on both sides of the wire. As Germany's surrender neared, the boundaries between enemy and caretaker blurred even further. At Camp Grant, Illinois, nurses treated rows of men suffering from frostbite and trench infections. Many were barely more than boys, drafted farmhands from Bavaria and Saxony. They watched, wide-eyed, as the women they'd been told to fear knelt beside their beds with steady hands and fluent words. On one bitter April morning, a nurse named Helen Kruger, whose father had emigrated from Hamburg decades earlier, tended to a dying corporal. He clutched a blood-stained photograph, a wife and infant daughter. Through labored breath, he whispered in German, asking her to tell his family he was sorry. She understood every word. She promised she would write. The man died before sunrise. Weeks later, she kept that promise. A letter sent through the International Red Cross reached a small town near Munich that summer. Stories like hers echoed quietly across dozens of camps. American nurses, many in their 20s, became witnesses to both the brutality and the redemption of war. They saw enemies become patients and patients become people again. What began as a medical duty had evolved into something unrecorded by official reports, a shared moment of decency amid collapse. Even hardened Wehrmacht officers, who once barked orders at subordinates, now thanked their American nurses with trembling voices. One wrote in his post-war diary, "She spoke my language. For the first time, I felt forgiven." When victory in Europe was declared in May 1945, the hospitals erupted in celebration. But behind the guarded fences, the German wards stayed quiet. Nurses still worked their rounds, still spoke softly in German, still wrote home for men who could not. The gunfire had stopped, but the healing, the truest kind, had only just begun when the war ended. The camps began to empty. Trainloads of German prisoners were sent back across the Atlantic under Allied supervision. Many carried more than their belongings. They carried letters, photographs, and memories of nurses who had shown them mercy when the world was burning. Months later, the War Department received an unexpected wave of mail. Dozens of letters arrived from Germany, not from officials, but from former POWs. One read, "To the nurses of Camp Shanks, I was your patient. I will never forget your kindness. You healed more than my wounds." Some of those men would return years later as immigrants, bringing their families to the same country that had once held them captive. They spoke of America not as a conqueror, but as a nation that treated even its enemies with dignity. Historians studying post-war repatriation noted something remarkable. Prisoners who had received care from bilingual nurses were among the most eager to rebuild contact with the United States. Compassion had done what propaganda could not. It had rewritten perception. In their quiet way, these women had changed how former enemies saw an entire nation. Official records later confirmed what compassion had already proven. In 1946, a U.S. Army Medical Department review reported that recovery rates among German prisoners treated in bilingual wards were significantly higher than standard. Nurses who could speak to their patients directly reduced anxiety, encouraged cooperation, and often prevented self-harm. The Red Cross documented similar findings in Europe. German repatriates cited their treatment in American camps as the most humane experience of captivity. These testimonies circulated quietly among Allied officials and later contributed to the Geneva Convention revisions of 1949, emphasizing not just humane conditions, but psychological care and communication. Yet for the nurses themselves, few medals or citations followed. Their service was overshadowed by the more visible heroes of battlefields and bombers. Many returned to civilian hospitals, raising families, never speaking of the men they had once treated behind barbed wire. But their influence endured in silence, in the letters preserved in archives, in the gratitude passed from fathers to sons across 2 continents. They hadn't just treated wounds, they had treated memory itself, healing the very perception of what mercy could look like in war. In every war, there are victories measured in ground gained, battles won, and enemies defeated. But some victories are quieter, measured not in miles, but in mercy. The American nurses who spoke German inside those prison wards never carried rifles or wore medals. Their weapons were words, calm, fluent, human. In a time when nations spoke in bombs and manifestos, they spoke in the language of care. And that, perhaps, was the most subversive act of all. They reminded both sides that civilization is not proven in conquest, but in compassion. When the uniforms faded and the guns were stored away, what endured was the memory of a voice saying softly, "You're safe now." Years later, some of those former prisoners would write to the U.S. Embassy, asking only one question: "Do you know what became of the nurses?" History rarely records their names, but in the long arc of war, their work stands as proof that empathy can cross even the sharpest wire. They won no medals. Yet, in the hearts of the men they healed, they won something far greater: peace.